You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
In a dramatic escalation in the ongoing Ukraine crisis, Russian President Vladimir Putin on 21st February recognized the independence of two separatist regions in eastern Ukraine and ordered Russian forces in those territories for quote-unquote peacekeeping purposes. In a televised address, Putin recognized the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, which are globally considered as part of Ukraine's sovereign territory, and added that quote-unquote Ukraine has never had its own authentic statehood. Putin's address also carried a warning for Ukraine, threatening a war if the country's forces do not stand down. He said that, quote-unquote, all the responsibility for the possible continuation of bloodshed will be completely and entirely on the conscience of the regime ruling Ukraine's territory. For weeks now, Putin has kept the world on its toes with some 150,000 Russian troops amassed at Ukraine's border, but has denied any plans to move into Ukraine. However, the formal recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk has triggered fears in the West of an imminent Russian invasion. The formal recognition also prompted a chorus of condemnations from the West, with the US announcing sanctions for those regions, Germany halting the approval process of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia, and the United Nations Security Council condemning Russia's move, calling it a quote-unquote violation of territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, and that it is inconsistent with the principles of the UN Charter. Criticism on Russia also came from India, who at the UNSC meeting said that tensions along the border between Ukraine and Russia was a matter of deep concern and that it had the potential to undermine peace and security in the region. However, India stopped short of condemning Putin's statement or its actions without naming Russia at all. So in today's episode, we'll dive deep into the relevance of Donetsk and Luhansk and why Russia deems them independent. To understand this, I spoke to former Indian ambassador to Russia, Ambassador D.B. Venkatesh Verma, who recently returned from Russia. You're tuned in to The Big Story, the podcast where we dissect the headline-making news for you, and I'm your host, Himmat. Ambassador Verma, thank you so much for coming on the Big Story podcast and making time for us.
Hemant, good to be with you, and thank you for inviting me.
Okay. Well, first, I, of course, want to talk to you about what's happening in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which is the big story of the day as well. Like, from my understanding, these are regions in eastern Ukraine and are home to about 2.3 million and 1.5 million people, respectively. So, can you help us understand what is the region's history and why they are being labeled as People's Republic in the first place?
Yeah, sure. Ukraine is a large country. Ukraine is, except for Russia, Ukraine is the largest country in Europe. And it was put together in 1919 and again 1921. And further territory was added in 1945. And 1956. So Western Ukraine acquired a lot of territory because Germany, which had occupied Poland in the Second World War, was defeated in the Second World War, and therefore some of the Polish territories were added on to Western Ukraine. In Eastern Ukraine, this was formed as a result of the 1921-22 Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was formed. It's formed part of the constituent republic of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was created in 1922, and the constituent elements of the Soviet Union were the Russian Federation, the Ukraine, Belarus, and in those days it was called the Transcaucasian Republic, presently Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and others. And you had the East and the Turkestan Central Asian republics joined later. Now, Ukraine was always a multi-regional country, a state within the Soviet Union. And the Eastern Ukraine was largely dominated by Russian-speaking people. It was also heavily industrialized. And the purpose of creating industrialization in Eastern Ukraine was to give a sense of identity and stakeholdership for the Ukrainian people in the larger Soviet Union. Now, in the context of the events that took place last evening, there are two so-called People's Republics, Lugansk and Donetsk, which in a sense belonged to Ukraine, but after the changeover in government in 2014, which Russia believes was the result of a coup d'etat. You remember that there was a lot of demonstrations in the main square in Kyiv, which was called the Maidan demonstrations. And the then president was had to flee because there was a lot of violence on the streets, both from the security forces, from the protesters, and some unknown people who participated in those shootings. But the net result was that the government fell, and the new government came into power in Kyiv, which had a very strong anti-Russia orientation, including against the eastern regions of Ukraine, where Russian was the majority language. Now, these two republics declared their independence in 2014. The proclamation of independence was done in 2014, but no one in a sense recognized it. In 2015, the second Minsk agreement was signed. It was essentially brokered by France and Germany, and also Russia was a partner, but not a signatory to the Minsk agreement. And the essential idea of the Minsk agreement was that Kyiv, the central government in Kyiv, would discuss with the leaderships of these two republics, the so-called People's Republics, because they wanted to distinguish themselves from the republics that were there, the regions that were there prior to the 2014 declaration of proclamation of independence. The two key principles of the Minsk agreement were the following. One is that the central parliament in Kyiv would pass legislation to create autonomy for the eastern regions. There would be a ceasefire, heavy equipment would be withdrawn, and after autonomy was given, elections would be held, and as soon as elections would be held, and a government would be formed in the two eastern regions, and thereafter Ukraine would take over the control of the border with Russia.
Okay.
So internal autonomy within the context of protection of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine.
Okay.
Now, Russia supported the Minsk agreement, but was very disappointed because the Kyiv authorities, including the Ukrainian parliament and the Ukrainian government, were not keen to fully implement the Minsk agreement. Now, of course, Ukraine had its own complaints, and some of the complaints were valid because they said that a full ceasefire had not returned to the Donbas region, the larger region, and they were not in a position to proceed on autonomy. The two regions said that they were almost against the two regions of eastern Ukraine, and they were short of constitutionally mandated autonomy. They were not willing to give up their arms. So the skirmishes continued for a very long time. There was no implementation of the Minsk agreement. The Normandy format was also brought into place to facilitate a dialogue, to implementation of ceasefire and to facilitate a dialogue. It didn't work. The extreme nationalists in Ukraine also were not in favor of granting autonomy to the eastern regions of Ukraine, thinking that they would secede if they give them autonomy. So the internal divisions in Ukraine were very deep.
Yeah.
And in this last 7 years, these internal divisions were not bridged, and they only became deeper.
There's also now talks of reviving the Minsk Peace Agreement of 2015 as well. Is it possible that reviving it now will stop Russia from invading Ukraine?
No, things have moved ahead because Russia last night formally recognized the independence of the two breakaway republics of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And by recognizing the independence, they have, in a sense, accepted that the territorial integrity of Ukraine, as internationally recognized, would no longer apply. So, in a sense, the Minsk agreement would be overtaken by events. However, since Russia is not a party to the Minsk agreement, if in theory the government in Kyiv were to hold talks with the two republics, that would be consistent with the Minsk agreement, but it is extremely unlikely in this very charged political situation. There would be willingness on part of the central government in Kyiv to talk to leaders who have just declared their independence. It is, I don't think, going to happen. So therefore, in theory, the Minsk agreement exists, but in reality, I think it is on its last legs.
Now, of course, Russia's recent steps have invited international condemnation as well, especially from the US, which has now issued sanctions for those separatist regions as well. There was also this emergency UNSC meeting, the United Nations Security Council meeting, on 21st February, just yesterday, where Russia's actions were labeled as a violation of the UN Charter and the sanctity of national borders. I want to know, sir, that you, of course, have had close contact with the Kremlin and with President Putin as well. And I want to know, to what extent will this kind of international condemnation really affect Putin and his intentions? And if not, what will it take?
Yeah, there were a range of views. The countries from Europe and the United States were very strong in their condemnation of what happened yesterday. But the statements from other countries, especially from Asia, were more nuanced. There was no condemnation from many of the countries that spoke from the Asian region. India made a very balanced statement. I think we stressed the need for dialogue and moving forward on creating conditions for de-escalation.
Yeah,
I think China also made a similar statement. I don't think there was any condemnation from their side as well. The UAE statement was also quite moderate. You see, the fact that Russia has had a problem with the emerging security situation in Ukraine is not a new problem.
Yeah,
it has been there for almost 15-20 years. And Russia was able to manage with various governments in Kyiv a process of business-like relations. They were not very friendly, but at least they were very business-like, in the sense there was normal trade and transport links were there. I think the situation got aggravated after 2008, when Ukraine was given the promise of NATO membership. It was not given NATO membership, but it was given the promise of NATO membership. I think that encouraged that section of the Ukrainian leadership that was very interested in joining EU and NATO to accelerate their antipathy to Russia, because if you think you have an alternative, then you tend not to work on compromises. So I think it created a false illusion for Ukraine that NATO would come to its rescue. NATO membership for Ukraine was not popular in Europe as well. France and Germany were against that proposition. It is the United States which put it on the table in the Bucharest summit of NATO, and that has created a very deep problem. Now, in theory, of course, Ukraine is a sovereign country. It has the right to choose its security relationships, but all sovereign countries also choose security relationships in a manner that do not aggravate their own security situation. So, by asserting a right, which is in theory right, Ukraine has. You should also judge your policies by the end result that they have created. And the end result they have created is that NATO has not come to Ukraine's defense because it's not a member of NATO, and two regions of Ukraine have gone away and declared independence. And relationship with Russia is now at rock bottom.
Yeah.
Now, Russia and Ukraine have existed together in the Soviet Union. Prior to that, as part of the Tsarist Empire, so their people-to-people contacts go back many centuries. So when you have such deep cultural, political, and economic links, it's very difficult to create a condition where you can divide the country. You can divide the peoples. Now, in my own view is that a certain amount of friendship was possible, provided Ukraine remained neutral. It didn't join NATO, but it had a very strong economic links with the European Union and strong economic links with Russia. I think that would have been a fairly good compromise that every country could have lived with. The strong orientation towards West by Ukraine and the fact that they would not be seen as threatening to Russia. I don't think it is merely President Putin's agenda. President Putin has been talking of this for a very long time.
Yeah.
No Russian president can accept the appearance of NATO troops so close to their borders, which is Ukraine, which is, it is like a foreign country coming and putting troops right next door, which no major country will accept. So I think mistakes were done on all sides. In retrospect, in hindsight, we can say that one country or a set of countries could have done things differently. But the end result is that we have in the center of Europe, 30 years after the end of the Cold War, the return of high military tensions and confrontation that my sense is that show no sign of abating anytime soon. So it will have huge consequences for the region and huge consequences for global stability as well.
So you also touched upon on India's statement at the UNSC as well, where India stated that the escalation of tensions along the border of Ukraine with the Russian Federation is a matter of deep concern. And of course, the safety of India's citizens present in Ukraine is the top priority as of now. But I wanted to know from your also decades of experience in this, will this neutrality stance play in India's favor in the long term, given India's close ties with both Russia and the US, and that President Putin may not climb down from his demands easily as well this time around?
You see, we have no hand in the current crisis that has been created by both sides in Central Europe. However, the effect of these events will have an impact on our interests as well. There will be, as a result of sanctions that are imposed on Russia, which are expected, there will be more difficulties on dealing with Russia. But Russia is a strategic partner for us. We have very strong ties in defense, in nuclear space, energy. So these ties will continue. India should, and I think India will be in a position to insulate itself from the blowback that is expected from this regional and international crisis. Of course, it cannot be 100% insulation, but we should try to reduce the negative effect. Now, both Russia and the United States cannot judge their relations with India on the basis of what India says or does not say. The primary factor for us is the protection of India's interests. We have not done anything to exacerbate the situation. There was a Minsk agreement that was signed, and we supported the Minsk agreement. Now, if the Ukrainian government is reluctant to accept the Minsk agreement, how is it that India is to blame? I mean, if the United States of America promised Ukraine NATO membership and was not able to provide the security of NATO countries to Ukraine in the current crisis, these are all self-created problems for other countries. How are we asked to explain? So this notion that somehow India should stand up and be asked to explain itself, I think, is a completely wrong notion. We have a balanced and a moderate policy, and we should speak about our own interests. A point is also sometimes made that India is not standing up for international rules and international law. But there were a number of agreements that both sides signed, and if they are not able to implement them, then how is it our fault? How is it that India is asked to explain? Rules-based international order means that those who accept the rules should also implement those rules. So if they don't, then of course the consequences are not positive.
Yeah. Well, sir, thank you for all your time and all your input as well. That was the end of my questions, but it was a genuine pleasure talking to you. Of course, since you just returned back from Russia as well, so you're the best person to speak to when it comes to what India should do as well and the international perspective. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast and making time for us.
Yeah, thank you, Himat, and a great pleasure to be with you.
If you liked listening to this episode, please subscribe to The Big Story for episodic updates. We're available on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, JioSaavn, and most of the other popular podcast streaming platforms. For other podcasts, please log on to the Quint website, and for any feedback, please shoot an email to podcast@thequint.com.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.